morning, Connecting for Change. I thank God for the privilege of being here with you today and bring you greetings from the Forward Together Moral Movement and the North Carolina NAACP and North Carolina and other places around the country. More than 200 organizations that are connected in this movement. To Janet Milkman, our executive director, let's give her a hand, and the Marion Institute for I want to talk this morning about what I believe we're in the middle of a third reconstruction and why it's a necessity in movement building to make sure that we have a firm moral foundation. I firmly believe that we are in the embryonic stages. And if we can fully grasp the power of a moral fusion intersectional movement building, we can birth it into existence. But now it's important for people to understand the power of the first and second Reconstruction. And while in some ways we talk about the Revolutionary War having its beginnings in Boston and in the North, the fact of the matter is the change that shook America took place in the South, called the First and Second Reconstruction, and it was rooted in the idea of moral fusion politics. Would you say that with me? Moral fusion politics. Because that moral fusion politics provides the imagination and the mechanisms to fundamentally shift history and the socio-political trajectory of the nation. And there are lessons from the First and Second Reconstructions that we must be applied and utilized in this moment in history. Now, the first Reconstruction took place in the shadow of slavery and amid the wreckage of the Civil War. Frederick Douglass, who was mentioned by my introducer, was a part of that Reconstruction. Using a moral framework, African Americans joined hands with whites in the North and in the South who were willing to see them as allies. I don't know if you know this, but by 1872, between 1868 and 1872, blacks and whites, progressives, controlled every state house in the South within 4 years after slavery. Together, this fusion coalition elected new leaders, many of them African Americans and many of them former slaves. And the makers of this Reconstruction began to hammer out, from a deeply moral perspective, new state and national constitutions that created national citizenship open to all people of all races. In fact, you need to know that this is the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, which led to the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which in some ways are the three most important amendments, along with the First Amendment, upon which we get the right to protest, and then the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, and later on the amendment that allowed 18-year-olds the right to vote. But all of that transformation came through the first Reconstruction. Between 1868 and 1872, I want you to understand, in the South, blacks and whites were working together. And what did they do from a deeply moral perspective? They built the first public schools. They made public education a public right in the Constitution in the South by 1868. They extended the ballot to all men, regardless of color, and later would extend it to all women. In the preamble of my own Constitution in North Carolina, listen what it said in 1868, not 2068, but 1868. We hold these truths that all persons are created equal, endowed with their creator by certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of your own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. They were talking about labor rights and wages for all people in 1868, long before the AFL-CIO. Blacks and whites knew that labor without living wages and without the enjoyment of the fruit of your own labor is just a pseudo form of slavery. They guaranteed people protection, equal protection under the law. They embraced new rules for the courts and the criminal justice system. They expanded the democracy. In 4 years, the experiment of Reconstruction was transforming America. But then it faced powerful, immoral opposition. Many of the former Confederates saw black citizenship and black leadership working together with white leadership as inherently illegitimate. Now, the first thing they began to do around 1872 was they formed the Ku Klux Klan, but not to go after black people, to attack white people. The Klan was formed to attack white people and to break up the fusion coalition, because even then they knew that fusion coalitions will always transform America. And then, in my state, it was not some backwoods people that formed the Klan. It was the leaders of the University of North Carolina, UNC. Colonel Sanders, who has a building still named after him on the campus. Then they attacked African-American leaders. Then they began to wail and call for the cutting of taxes so that the government could not provide the proper safety nets and other possibilities for people to rise up out of slavery and to become a part of this country in full citizenship. They also hated public schools. They did not want white and black children to be educated at the same level. They took on the ballot box. They didn't undo the 15th Amendment. They just began to suppress the vote and abridge the right to vote. The Tea Party, I'm sorry, wrong century, I'm sorry, but I get confused sometimes when I read this history. They took over the courts by 1880s. In fact, in 1875, we passed a law in this country, that civil rights law, that made it a felony for a business not to serve someone because of the color of their skin. But by 1883, by slowly taking over the courts, the Supreme Court voted against this law in 1883, and there was only one dissenter. His name was Justice Harlan. And you know what their mantra was? We have to take back America. You know what they put their pride in 1875, 1883? The right to own guns. You know what their motto was? We have come to redeem America. They use moral language for immoral purposes. Sound familiar? Then in 1898, with the Wilmington riots, unrest in the cities, the Springfield riots, the first Reconstruction was deconstructed. And then you could have about 40 or 50 years where black voting goes to almost 0% in the South. The Southern legislators are taken over by extremists, and because of that, the Congress in the United States becomes extreme, state houses become extreme, and all of the gains in public education and labor rights and many other things were wiped away. Then you get the second Reconstruction. Say second Reconstruction. That's 1954. Black, whites, Latinos, young people, women come together, willing to march, suffer, and build a new fusion movement with deep moral underpinnings. Leaders like Dr. King spoke of the moral urgency of now. This language in the streets and in the pulpits and from jail cells changed the language in the halls of power. Presidents and senators and congresspersons and governors and newspapers and poets began to write and talk about moral urgency. Listen at Langston Hughes writing in the middle of the Second Reconstruction. Oh, let America be America again. The land that never has been yet and yet must be. The land where every man is free. The land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negro, me. Who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. The second Reconstruction, I like to say, began with Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, May 17th. When you get 9 justices on the Supreme Court, one a former Ku Klux Klan member, to overturn separate but equal that was passed in 1896. It took 58 years to do that. A constant movement, building off of the dissent of Justice Harlan, who was also the only dissenter in that case in 1896. Thurgood Marshall used moral framework in order to push the courts. Listen what he said. Nobody will stand in the court and urge that in order to arrive at the decision that they want us to arrive at, there would have to be some recognition of a reason why all of the multitudinous groups of people in this country, you have singled out Negroes and give them this separate treatment. He went on to say that there was no way that the courts could keep separate but equal in place unless it disagreed with the deep moral foundation that all people were created as one. The second Reconstruction, 1954, think about what happens. You get integration or desegregation. You get Medicaid. You get Medicare during this second Reconstruction. Social Security is expanded in 1954 to include African Americans, because many African Americans were left out, because in the early rendition of Social Security, if you were in the agrarian culture or in the domestic culture, you could not pay into Social Security, which meant 50% of white women weren't even included. There was the War on Poverty, the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, minimum wage, War on Poverty. There was a moral commitment. Now, it cost people. There was a moral commitment. In fact, when the courts voted to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, there was this guy named Freddie Koch. He was the daddy of Charles and David Koch. Unless y'all have heard of them, the Koch brothers. Freddie Koch called for the impeachment of Earl Warren when the Warren court supported overturning separate but equal, and he called for the impeachment of Eisenhower when Eisenhower, as a Republican during the Second Reconstruction, said that funding public education was essential to our national security. So some of these folk have been a little crazy for a long time. I just thought I'd throw that in. Think about it. During the Second Reconstruction, programs like Head Start, Medicare, Social Security, K through 12 funding, Pell Grants for higher education, and all of these things had broad support. Now, Russell Sage reminds us, though, that you got to understand there were three parts to the War on Poverty. The first part was to boost wages, education, and job training. The second part was to provide income support, particularly for single mothers and the elderly. And the third was to bring a system of government health to the elderly and the poor. But there was also a fourth thing, and that was that the race and class were connected, because one of the lesser-known benefits of the War on Poverty was its linkage with the Civil Rights Movement. That's fusion. For instance, Medicare funds were withheld from hospitals if they didn't comply with the Civil Rights Act. That's how blacks began to have access to health care in the South. And we began to see powerful transformation. Child poverty was cut in half. Poverty among seniors was reduced by over 60%. Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act. Yes, people died, but it was during the Third Reconstruction. And each of these things that were done, they were framed as moral issues, not Democrat or Republican, not left or right, but moral fusion, intersectional issues in the streets, in the courts, and in the legislative streets. But again, there were people that could not stand this. So around about 65, 66, 68, or even more so during the whole period, but in a broad and brash way, the Dixiecrats, the extremists, revolted. They couldn't stand it. First, they turned to violence. They killed Martin, Malcolm. They killed Viola Wooster, a white woman, just 1 hour after the successful march from Selma to Montgomery, and so many others. Then they decided to launch the Southern Strategy. And guess what the mantra was? You heard it in the 1880s. We must redeem America. We must take our country back. Now, the white Southern strategy sought to reframe moral issues. Richard Nixon had a man named Kevin Phillips. Kevin Phillips said, I can show you how to win, Richard, but you've got to learn how to pit people against one another, and you've got to use race to do it. But you can't be out front about it, because you can't win if you talk like George Wallace talked in 1963, because now it's 64, it's 65, 66, 68. We have to find a way to talk about race with coded language. So they launched the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy was designed to attack black leaders, but also to cause white Southerners and whites in the suburbs of the North to vote against their own best interest. A race-based oligarchy would use wedge issues to separate fusion politics because they knew the power of fusion politics. Now, how did they do that? Well, Lee Atwater told on them. If you Google it up sometime, he was having an interview, and almost as though he forgot that he was being taped. This is what he said. I have to read it like it is. They said, what about this Southern strategy? He said, well, this is what we found out. That you start out in 1954 saying nigger, nigger, nigger. But by 1968, you can't say nigger because that'll hurt you. So you start saying coded language like we're against forced busing. We're for states' rights. We're for more guns. And he says, then you get really abstract. We're for cutting taxes. He said, now it sounds like the things you're talking about are totally economic things, but the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. Whites begin to feel that their problems are because of what blacks are receiving, and you begin to racialize entitlement programs in a way that causes poor people, most of whom are white, to vote against their own self-interest in the South. And then you add to this narrative, take the country back, and then you reframe the moral discussion so that morality in the public square is limited to homosexuality, abortion, and prayer in the school. Southern strategy. And all the while you say, we must take our country back. Now, what you have to understand, listening from the first Reconstruction, the second Reconstruction, the positives, and then how those reconstructions were deconstructed, is that we know, you must know that we have to be in the middle of the possibility of a third Reconstruction because you are seeing the same attacks today. The same attacks that have always tried to undermine a reconstruction are now trying to prevent a reconstruction. What do we see? Attacks on the courts, attack on voting rights, attack on labor rights, attack on public education, attack on fair taxes, particularly the poor and the working poor, attack on public education, attacks on health care. And what this means, and this racialized narrative that is still being produced on slides of Fox television stations that some of you all know. My point is that, but this time it's a little different. The deconstructionists have been afraid ever since President Obama got elected. Not because he's black, but because he was black, and more importantly, because an electorate came together in the South that was black, that was brown, that was white, that was gay, that was straight, that was young, that was old, and he won in the South. That electorate in the South changes the game plan. It breaks down the solid South. And if you open up the solid South, you open up the whole nation. So this time, the extremists, rather than waiting for the reconstruction to happen, are trying to deconstruct it. Well, really, they're trying to do something they claim they don't do. They're trying to abort it. They're trying to abort it. But the flip side of that is what we must understand. If they are working this hard to stop it, then we must be powerful enough to bring it into being. And the reason I know there's a third Reconstruction right at our fingertips is because of all the movements that are breaking out all over the place. Raise Up 15. You see white and black people walking together in Black Lives Matter. You see the Forward Together Moral Monday movement. You see labor beginning to get their backbone again. You see teachers standing up again. That means that we are in the birthing pains of a third Reconstruction. And I want to suggest 14 steps, some steps real quickly, that we have to engage in movement building to see this third Reconstruction to come to it. First of all, we need what I call an indigenously led, state-based, state government-focused, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative fusion movement. That's what we need. Now I know that doesn't fit a bumper sticker, but that's the problem. We've dumbed down the electorate so bad that we can't elevate people into a movement. Now, how do we get there? First of all, we need to engage indigenously led grassroots organizing across states. There is no such thing as helicopter leadership by so-called national leaders that can sustain a moral movement from the ground. Moral movements have to be built from the bottom up. Transformation in America does not come historically from D.C. down. It comes from Selma and Birmingham up. Up. You must build a movement up. Somebody say up. Next thing you have to do is you have to get inside of the state capitals, particularly around the country, because some of the worst attacks on women's rights and LGBT rights and public education and labor and living rights and voting rights are not happening in Washington, D.C. They are happening in state legislators. Number two, We need to use moral language to critique public policy regardless of who's in power. There must be a movement that says there's higher ground, not merely Democrat versus Republican. The fact of the matter is somebody has to stand up and say, it doesn't matter what party is in power or who has a supermajority, there are some things that are just wrong. They're just immoral. Notice, what am I saying? Sometimes progressives, when they hear these extremists say we want to read the Constitution, we run. We should say, no, let's read it. Because if you read the Constitution, you'll understand that the first principle is not freedom, but the establishment of justice and the promoting of the general welfare. Yeah. You want to talk about capitalism? Let's talk about capitalism from the standpoint of establishing justice. That would be a great conversation. That would be a great conversation. We also have to lose this language of left versus right. Left versus right language comes out of the French Revolution. The left people didn't want the monarchy. The right people wanted the monarchy. First of all, we're not in the 17th century. I wish some people would stop using left, right. And then, how many of you all claim to be kind of smart in school, been to school? Raise your hand. You at least know your ABCs, been through the first grade. Raise your hand. Well, then answer me this question. Why do progressives keep calling people right that then we want to turn around and say they're wrong? It's linguistically problematic. We need moral language that talks about when we examine a policy. It doesn't matter if it's left or right. Does it promote the general welfare? Does it provide for the common defense? Does it establish justice? Does it ensure domestic tranquility? Is it constitutionally consistent? Is it morally defensible? And is it economically sane? We need to use a new language as we deal with public policy. Next. We have to challenge the moral hypocrisy of the so-called religious right that are so religiously wrong. I want y'all to know I'm a theological evangelical conservative. Don't get scared, because the folk that claim they really are not. You know why? The greatest sin in all of the scriptures is idolatry. That's self-worship. The second greatest sin is mistreatment of the women, the children, the stranger, the poor, the sick, and the hurting. So I always ask these people that love to run on TV, and they say nothing about justice, nothing about the poor, nothing about how we treat the least of these, but they want to talk about things that aren't even hardly mentioned in the scriptures, like homosexuality, abortion, and prayer in the school. I want to ask them, how do you claim to be conservative if 2,000 scriptures speak to the issue of justice, less than 4 speak to the issues you talk about? None of the scriptures you talk about trump this scripture, you must love your neighbor as yourself. How do you claim to be a conservative when you won't conserve the essence of biblical faith and religion? No, you're not a conservative. What you are is you are what we call, you are engaging in heretical ontology. In other words, you're trying to suggest God said something when God didn't say nothing like what you're talking about. Next, we have to unite around a moral agenda. Say moral agenda. You know, I'm kind of tired of going to conferences where everybody's trying to figure out what should we be fighting for. By now, we ought to know. So let me suggest a few things. Can we agree? Maybe we ought to have some conference say, we already know what to fight for. Let's come to the conference and figure out how to fight. Can we agree that if America is going to be a great nation for all people, we must secure pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that ensure economic sustainability by fighting for full employment, living wages, the alleviation of disparity in employment, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones, strong safety nets for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, infrastructure development, ceasing war baiting that undermines our ability to fix things at home, and extreme militarism, a fair tax system. Can we kind of agree that all of us agree on that? Can we agree, number 2, that every child should receive a high-quality, well-funded, constitutionally diverse public education as well as access to community colleges and universities? Can we agree that we should agree on health care for all? Since Teddy Roosevelt talked about it over 100 years ago, we ought to have it today. And we should not be fighting. We should not be fighting the Affordable Care Act. We should not be fighting Medicaid expansion, but then we should go past that until everybody has health care regardless of who they are. Can we agree on that? Can we agree that we ought to protect Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare? Can we agree that a part of our health agenda ought to be ensuring women's right to women's health, and we ought to be ensuring environmental protection, because there might be water on Mars, but we haven't gotten there yet? Can we agree that we want fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities that affect black, brown, and poor white people? And can we agree to expand voting rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, and demand, no matter what Donald Trump said, that the 14th Amendment equal protection under the law is as American as all of us, and we are not going to repeal the 14th Amendment. Now, we ought to be able to agree on that basic agenda. And then we ought to agree on the intersectionality of them. You can't fight for those things in silos, because when you check the record, the same people fighting environmental justice are fighting public education. The same people fighting public education are fighting Medicaid expansion. The same people fighting Medicaid expansion are fighting women's reproductive health. The same people fighting women's reproductive health are fighting against the LGBT community. The same people fighting the LGBT community are fighting labor rights. The same people fighting labor rights are fighting voting rights. The truth is, if they are cynical enough to be together, we ought to be courageous and smart enough to come together and build a moral fusion movement. Then we must demonstrate a commitment to civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, so that we can drive home how serious these issues are. And then next, we must build a stage from which to lift the voices of everyday people. We've got to put a focus on these numbers. When 8 million people are being denied Medicaid expansion, we've got to have people that are sick and dying, like you saw on that tape, testifying and being in front of the camera. When the poor need to have a voice, we need to build platforms, not just for the experts, but for the people experiencing the pain that's being created by these extreme policies. Then we've got to recognize the centrality of race. You can't build any movement in this country just not dealing with the issue of race and racism and America's original sin. When somebody asks you, is it race or is it class? You simply say, it is. Don't try to engage in some kind of false dichotomy. It is. It's race and class. And a moral movement has to take on race directly. And let me just say this. And the race argument and the race critique should not always come from black people. Sometimes the race critique should come from white people. And the class critique should come from black people, because what we're saying is, no longer will you divide us along the issues of race and class. Then we must build a broad and diverse coalition, including moral and religious leaders of all faith. You heard me say moral. I don't mean that it's of any particular religion. But you cannot throw faith away. We must build a faith, and we must have a place where even people who are people of non-faith, who are atheists even, but they believe in a moral universe, can come together around a comprehensive agenda. Then we must make a serious commitment to academic and empirical analysis of policy, because nothing is worse than being loud and wrong. Then we have to utilize social media in all of its form: video, text, Twitter, Facebook. You know, Harriet Tubman got 500 slaves out of slavery. She didn't have Twitter, she didn't have text, she didn't have Facebook. All she had was a moss on the north side of a tree and a North Star in the sky, a .38 pistol in her pocket in case you didn't really want to be free. She was going to make sure you didn't go back and tell on the rest of them. And if she did all of that without Twitter and text and Facebook, what would happen if we coordinate all of our social media and understand that the mainstream outlets are often unable to tell the story that doesn't fit with their established way of seeing things? Number 11, we must engage in voter protection and registration and education. Understand, my brothers and sisters, we have less voting rights today than we had 50 years ago. If you went to see the movie Selma, we have less voting rights today with the undermining of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court than we had 50 years ago. And if you're concerned about any of the things I mentioned, health care, education, equal protection under the law, criminal justice reform, class poverty, living wages, then you cannot dismiss what is going on with voting rights. The attempt to suppress the right to vote, particularly out in the South. I come from the state that has the worst voter suppression law in the country. Right now, 50 years after Selma, we haven't seen anything like it since the 50s. We have the worst redistricting plan since the 19th century. That's not just about North Carolina, that's about America. Because if you can suppress the vote in the South and you can undermine fusion politics, the ability for black and white and Latinos to work together and vote together, then you can lock down America for another 20 years. If you lock up the South, you lock up progressive politics. Then we have to pursue a strong legal strategy. Then we have to engage in cultural arts, because a movement is only as strong as how we sing together, how we spoken word together, how we storytell together, how we do arts together. That arts have to be at the center of building a movement. And then we must resist the one moment mentality. Nobody is interested in you if you just send one text, one email, or just have one rally. You've got to stay with it. So in the moral movement, we've been with it now 10 years. Started when Democrats were in. We got stronger when extremists came in who called themselves Republicans, who've been sniffing Coke, K-O-C-H, and drinking that brew called Tea Party tea. We stood up to them. People said, since they had a supermajority, we had to just go home. We said, no, we don't go home. We stand up. We fight back. We've been having Moral Mondays now, over 150 different actions. When we started, only about 40% of North Carolinians wanted Medicaid expansion. Now the polls say that over 60% want it. When we started, under 40% of North Carolinians wanted living wages. They didn't understand. But now that we've kept on raising the moral consciousness, over 60, 70, 80% want living wages, according to which poll? What have we learned? We've learned when you build a moral fusion movement, 1,000 people have committed civil disobedience, 1,000 of them. And they were black, they were white, they were Latino, they were young, they were old, they were Republican, they were Democrat, they were gay, they were straight, they were business leaders, they were labor leaders, they were teachers, they were doctors, they were students, they were the sick. 1,000, more people than in the history of this union. When we started, the governor was at 50%. Now he's at 35% and falling. When we started, the legislature was at 40%. Now they're at 17% and falling. We've had more than 1,000 clergy from all different faiths to rally together around this moral agenda. And on February 5th, 2014, 100,000 people showed up in the street in Raleigh. 100,000 people, the largest gathering since Selma. Now, some of the national media didn't tell you about it because they don't quite understand it. They don't understand seeing the president of the NAACP, who happens to be black, standing there, but surrounded by 60% white people in the South. They really don't know what to do with it because they don't understand this history of the First and Second Reconstruction and moral fusion politics. They don't know what to do. When I remember the first day we went into the legislature to do civil disobedience, and when we were there, one of the extremists said, I thought the NAACP was coming. What are all these white people doing here? Well, what they don't know is that the founders of the NAACP were white. There were only 2 black people on the original founding board of the NAACP. But more importantly, what they don't understand is this nation has always been transformed when we come together. We come together and build a moral fusion movement. Let me tell you one story, and I'm through for today, of how this works. Because North Carolina is the only place in the country where Tea Party state legislators lost in their own districts, in so-called safe districts. You say, how did that happen? Well, it happened in the mountains of North Carolina in a place called Appalachian. Well, how did that happen? Well, we were doing Moral Monday for about 13 weeks. Almost 900 people had been arrested, and then the legislature shut down, and so we decided to go out west to make our first stop outside of Raleigh. On our way to go to Asheville, North Carolina, I got a call. The call went like this: will you come to Mitchell County? I know there's some young people in here, but you can handle it. Now, I'm a preacher, but forgive me later. I said, hell no. Now, the reason I said that is because Mitchell County is 99% white, 89% Republican. 1920, they ran all the black people out of Mitchell County because they allegedly said a black man raped a white woman. So and most of the paramilitary groups are up in that area in Mitchell County. in North Carolina. But a friend of mine who's a white minister, Methodist minister, called me and said, Barber, you got to go. I'll go with you. Because you've been talking about a moral movement, not a Democrat versus Republican movement. And there are people up there that can be changed if we can take this movement and change the language. So I said, okay, Doc, if you go with me, I'll go get crucified too. I got up that Sunday morning and kissed my wife real good because I didn't know if I was going to see her again. I went to church, and some of the brothers and sisters in the African-American church understand I preached real good that morning because, see, in our tradition, if you die, you want them to put a little black shawl over the chair after you're dead. Now, if they only leave it there one Sunday, that means they are glad that God delivered them from you. But if they leave it there 2 or 3 weeks, that means that they really miss you. So I preached real good, got in the car, took 2 singers with me, took my security guy. Yeah, well, he's not really security. He's got 1 gun with 1 bullet. It's rusted. Might give you gangrene, but it probably won't hurt you. When we get to Mitchell County, a guy comes out to the car and says, hello, are you Dr. Barber? I said, I am. He says, well, you know, we don't want to talk about Democrat and Republican. He said, I'm a Republican myself, so don't talk about that. I said, yes, sir. He said, but we want to listen to you and hear what you got to say. I said, all right. He said, do you know the song, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds? I said, I sure do. You used to sing it with my grandmama and granddaddy all the time. So that's what we're going to sing. He said, do you know the scripture in the Bible about when Jesus came into Jerusalem and he took a whoop and he whipped all of the money changers out of the temple because they were abusing the poor people? I said, yes, that was the first Moral Monday. It happened Monday of Holy Week. He said, We went inside. He introduced me. The singer sang. I stood up. And kind of like some of you all, they were looking, who is this guy? What do he want? I said, I might as well go for it. So I said, I'm not here today to talk about Republican and Democrat. I'm here to talk about how you elected people and they went to Raleigh, but look at what they're doing to you. So I told them about Medicaid expansion and how many white people up in those mountains needed Medicaid expansion and how many were dying, literally dying. Because for every 2,500 people denied Medicaid, 500,000 people that died Medicaid, 2,500 died. They said, we didn't know that. I talked to them about unemployment and how because they didn't have labor rights, the corporations had left that area. The railroads were gone, and they couldn't do anything about it. I talked about public education and how because this legislature had cut public education by over $1 billion, it was hurting teachers and hurting public education. We went on to talk about those things, and I said, but they ran telling you that they were against homosexuality, against abortion, and for prayer in the school. That's what they told you they were going to do. But let's look at what they've done. What they've done is they've actually gone to legislature and they have given more to the wealthy and hurt you all who are poor right here in the mountain. It was quiet. And after I finished about an hour, because I talked long because I didn't know what was going to happen after I stopped, I said, okay. And they said, well, Reverend Barber, let me tell you something. We want to tell you something. You say, see that man right there? I said, yes, sir, that's the chair of the Republican Party. He just resigned last week because he declared he was a Lincoln-Eisenhower Republican, not a Tea Party Republican. I said, my goodness. They said, Reverend Barber, we also want you to know we've been coming down tomorrow, Monday. We just didn't tell anybody. We wanted to see whether or not this movement was just an arm of the Democratic Party or whether you all were serious about building a fusion movement and transformative politics. I said, all right. Then they said, can we form a branch of the NAACP? Well, about that time, I was kind of leaning like I was going to fall out because we never even thought about having an NAACP chapter in Mitchell County. It's 99% white, 89% Republican. And I told you, most of the black people were ran out. In fact, there was no black people. Well, there was one guy, but he was like an albino. He didn't even look black. And so when I said, what? You want to do what? She said, we want to form a branch of the NAACP. I said, okay. And they have. It's the most diverse branch of the NAACP now, over 200 members and growing. The leader of it, and I'm through, the leader of it is about a 65-year-old white woman who's a conservative preacher, but she is strong on race and strong on labor and strong on class and strong on protection of women and strong on protecting people of different sexualities. And then about 9:30, they said, we got one more request, Reverend Barber. They said, will you lead us on a march? I said, march where? It's 9:30 at night. They said, we're going to march on the house of the Tea Party legislator that we sent to Raleigh to tell him we don't agree with his policies. y'all want to march at night? Now, by this time, I knew I had them. So I decided to get real comfortable. I said, let me tell you something, white people. We didn't start marching at night. Somebody else started that. Black folk don't march at night. I tell you right now, we don't march at night. But tomorrow in Asheville, we'll be marching. And if you drive down the mountain to Asheville, you can join us. They said we'll be there. And the next day, we had hoped for 500 people in Asheville. But using this moral fusion framework, 10,000 people showed up in Asheville. And then those people got together, black and white and Democrat and Republican. They never called people Republican or Democrat, but they voted out the Tea Party extremists and put in people who are more concerned about the people. I'm telling you, those Tea Party extremists thought they were in safe district. But when we all get together, when we learn how to come together around a moral agenda and use moral language, when we believe in the possibility of a third Reconstruction, we can change the South. We can change America. We can change this generation. It's time for a third Reconstruction. God bless you.